Hi everyone, my name is Brian Lee, and this is my presentation for PPA 517. My topic was minimum wage increases and looking at both the liberal and conservative viewpoints on the benefits of them. So for the introduction and research question, the current minimum wage of California is at $12, and I was looking at whether or not minimum wage increases would be beneficial for wage workers. As you know, there's a high cost of living in California. So when we look at the arguments from the liberal and conservative side, from the liberal side, minimum wage increases allow for increases in standard of living. And from the conservative side, minimum wage increases allow for increases of economic activity through increased consumer spending. And then there's also no harm to small businesses as well that we'll touch upon later. For the literature review section, I looked at 5 different academic resources. Starting with the first one, are local minimum wages absorbed by price increases, estimates from internet-based restaurant menus. So this was a look at 884 internet-based restaurants after a California minimum wage increase. There were small changes in menu prices, but it didn't affect employment and didn't decrease businesses. So the thought process was that if minimum wages would increase, prices would increase, and consumers would move towards other cities that didn't have the wage increase, but this wasn't true. In the second reading, estimation of health benefits from a local living wage ordinance, it found that there were improvements to health, improvements to education of children of wage workers, and reduced premarital childbirth amongst youth when wages were increased. And the third academic resource, the economic effects of a citywide minimum wage, there were increased work pays and decreased wage inequalities between different workers. There were no detectable negative effects as well. Restaurants responded with small price increases, longer employment of current employees, and increases to number of full-time workers. They looked primarily at restaurants because that's where primarily wage workers work. So in the literature review continued, the fourth reading said, living wage policies at the San Francisco airport impacts on workers and businesses. 8,000 out of 11,000 workers received wage increases. Increased health benefits were found, reduced income inequality, like the reading before, and increased quality of life. And the cost, the airline was able to do a cost report, 0.7% of the airline's revenue, or $1.42 per person on average. So this was the minimum cost for providing those worker minimum wage increases. And in the last resource, the effect of Detroit's living wage law on nonprofit organizations, 96 nonprofit organizations were analyzed after the 1998 Detroit living wage increase. They found that no threat to employees or employers of nonprofits. And they specifically analyzed nonprofits because nonprofits have been well known for struggling on budgets and funding. And so if wage increases were to happen, nonprofits would be one of the organizations affected by it the most. And they found that was not the case. In research methods and sampling design, this section I kind of went over how I was designing the research method. It was a quasi-experimental field study. It was a random sample of wage workers across the state of California, and the variables to consider are, the industry type, the location, family size. Also, I didn't include it on the slide, but the demographics of people as well too. All those come into play when looking at the different wage workers across California because those have an effect on the outcomes that we have. And so for the survey design and consent forms section, to the right, I kind of included an infographic of what a survey might include depending on certain things. And the questions to be asked are, what is your occupation? How much is your current wage exactly? What county of California do you reside in? How many adults and children live in your current household? On average, how much do you spend on food and necessities each week? Has anyone at your current work been let go due to the increases of wages? These are just a few questions besides the demographic questions that will attempt to assess the research question and answer it, and pull data from the wage workers to see if it's actually changing things in the economic realm and the socioeconomic realm. So for the spreadsheets, graphs, and charts section, I looked at 3 different figures. In figure 1, called home prices higher in California than in other large states, California is ranked one of the highest in terms of home prices. As you can see, the top bar is California, and the US average is right around there in the middle. So California as a whole just dominates in terms of home pricing. And this is a major factor considering that living wage is different than the minimum wage right now. In figure 2, called minimum wage increases boost consumer spending after the following year, minimum wages were increased from July 2007 to July 2009, and this caused a consumer spending increase. So if we see in July 2007, there were $1.7 in terms of billions that were spent on consumer products. And then moving 2 years after that, that increased roughly 5 times the amount. So in essence, more money, more spending. People were provided with more money in terms of the wage increase and thus could spend more on the economy. So any amount spent on the economy is a boost to that. And in figure 3, this was from the living wage calculator site, and it compared 3 different things across a multitude of factors. So living wage versus poverty wage versus minimum wage, and compared against 1 adult to 2 adults with 1 working in the household and 2 adults both working in the household. The living wage was significantly higher, especially with no children in the house, or with more children in the household. So if we look, for example, at 1 adult and 3 children, the living wage is $48. So that's what you have to make in order to, have a good living standards with your family. And the minimum wage is currently $12 in California. So if we compare the two, it's roughly 3 or 4 times more than that of the minimum wage that is necessity for either 1 adult or 2 adults, and depending on the size of the household. When we look at validity, there's 2 different types, internal and external validity. I chose 2 different ones for the internal validity side. Basically, the internal validity is the truth in the study. How do we make sure that the facts and figures and everything that we're looking at is valid for people to believe in? And so the 2 factors that I looked at were selection bias and experimental mortality. Selection bias was important because the info must be gathered from participants, including the wage per hour, race, family size, gender, geographical location, and sector of work. These are all important because if you don't select or control for those types of things, there are way too many factors that will be in effect, and that could affect your outcomes further down the line. And for experimental mortality, I put wage work is temporary. A lot of the wage workers that we will analyze through this study may not be wage workers at the end of the study. So you have to take that into account too. There's different for different participants of the study, they'll be at different places in their lives in terms of work, and so they may not fulfill what we need them to fulfill. And for the external validity side of things, basically external validity is how it can be replicated or how it can explain other things besides what our focus is. And our focus is the state of California. And it's roughly hard to generalize this data with other states because California is so unique and so populous and diverse compared to other states. So when we take this data that we gain from this California study on wages, it's not to say that it's directly applicable to other states. We would have to, control for other things or assess the states that we look at themselves, just because everything is different compared to California, especially if we go on a more municipal level or local level as well. So in conclusion, there seems to be a relationship between increased wages and economic activity and standard of living for wage workers. All the readings and the facts and figures definitely state that the living wage is way higher compared to that of the minimum wage. And there are potential benefits that come from increasing the minimum wage to that closer to that of the living wage. And so from the liberal side, we see that there's both a socioeconomic factor to it. Increased wages allow for household income to increase, and that's just beneficial for all members of the family, and also increases potential health benefits, increases education potential for the children in the household, and in general, from the readings and from the data that could come out of it, you probably see that there is a long-term health effect with wage increases. And for the conservative side, we see that conservatives' vision or views are on the economy. So when we look at that, there's obviously an increased amount of consumer spending when we increase wages, and this contributes to the economy if you're putting money back into businesses and consumer products. Also, on that note, a lot of the readings and a lot of the data didn't suggest any negative effects to small businesses or any organizations that could be affected by living wage increases such as this. And from that, we see both on the liberal and conservative side that wages increased will probably provide a beneficial outcome.